One suggestion that I've heard that seemed to make sense is that we would distribute the 535 funds regionally by population, so it's proportional throughout the state, and then within a region that there could be a localized methodology that could be used. And that way we would most likely not find ourselves overlooking communities that are experiencing some of the highest rates of pollution.
I think that's probably the way it has to be done, because the regional entities, whether they be the larger transit agencies or the MPOs or the housing authorities, are going to have to play a significant role here in terms of the resources. But then there has to be an assurance that the dollars within a region are going to be spent in ways that are consistent with the existing state law. I mean, 535.
That's a given.
And right. So we're still working on how we do that, and working with the ARB and others to make sure that that's tight.
Let me just add one last thing, is whatever the final construct is, we want to make sure that we're sensitive and we meet the needs of these communities. So I think we're going to work from meeting our goals and work backwards. And I think whatever the end construct looks like, we want to make sure that we just meet the goals. Again, that's one option that obviously that you've suggested. We're going to explore many options and just to ultimately meet our goal, which is, again, to distribute the dollars in an equitable manner that for communities that are impacted, again, by climate change under the criteria of SB 535.
Very good. We have questions from Senator Monning, then Senator Jackson, and Senator Liu.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Senator Steinberg de Leon for framing this, bringing it forward. It's exactly what we need to be doing in terms of being proactive and thoughtful in the investment of these dollars. And I guess my questions revolve partly around just the framing of these percentage allocations and some clarification questions. The inner city rail, which I know Senator Steinberg indicated could be looked at as part of the high-speed rail vision. I know some of the high-speed rail money, and I think this hasn't gotten enough publicity, has already been invested in converting diesel in some commuter rail to electric from San Francisco to southern Santa Clara County. And those are some immediate investments that have an immediate environmental benefit, and also provide investments in communities that may not be on the rail line of the envisioned high-speed rail. But I'm curious about how you arrived at the 5% allocation, and whether or not in the first section that's more generally described as transit, whether any intercity rail could also qualify under that broader category. The areas of Central California you alluded to, we have a lot of low-income workers. The two highest employers in my district are agriculture and hospitality tourism, and that's predominantly an immigrant workforce. And every day, driving from King City to Watsonville to pick strawberries, or driving from Salinas or Watsonville or Castroville to the Monterey Peninsula in older model cars, and there is a rush hour in the Monterey Bay region every day of workforce driving to jobs in stopped traffic, and there's an abandoned rail line that connects Salinas to the Monterey Peninsula, the old Del Monte rail line. If that were converted to electric commuter rail, you would immediately serve a population that's paying a high percentage of their limited paycheck for gas. If you connect to those work points and provide at those hubs other transit options to get to the work site. So I was encouraged by the chair's framing of making sure we look at these allocations regionally as well, because while it sounds like a lot, when we start dividing it up among 58 counties, it's actually not going to be that much. So we have to figure out a method where we get the most return on our investment and serve the most people immediately. So that's a little more of a statement than a question, but I guess to wrap up with a question on the intercity rail, how did you arrive at the 5%, and could the broader first category of transit, could that also be used for intercity rail, light rail, commuter rail? We have two types of rail in California, at least two. One is to serve tourism, which high-speed rail will move people north to south who want to see our state. But the day-to-day is more commuter rail and moving workforce. That's where I think the investment in intercity rail may have a more immediate, broader impact on workforce. So,
how did we come to these percentages? Very carefully. I mean, this was, I put out an initial template, and then, we discussed, Senator De Leon and I, but also a number of our colleagues, and worked together to come up with what we have here. On the intercity rail, the 5% is actually what the intercity rail advocates asked for. So that was what they asked for, what they need. Now, could some of the transit money be used to help fund intercity rail, even though the distribution methods and the funding allocation methodologies are different? Sure, depending upon the region. Remember that under the original high-speed rail vote that we took back several years ago, that there was a component of intercity rail within that as well. So there's obviously crossover there as well.
Thank you, Senator Bonning. Senator Jackson, then Senator Liu, Senator Block, and Senator Bell.
Yes, thank you very much for presenting this today. I have a question from which other questions will proceed, and that is, are we talking about making this a continuous allocation? This isn't just in this budget year, but this is going forward, that you're looking to set up some kind of a long-term distribution plan of what we anticipate will be billions of dollars coming into cap and trade. Is that accurate? Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. Right now, it's not we're not seeking a constitutional amendment here, so a future legislature could, in fact, change or tweak the percentages. But really, when you're talking about infrastructure, long-term planning is essential.
Absolutely.
And that's why, the words that resonate with me are permanent source. Now, again, we're talking about a statute, and a statute can be changed, but permanent source gives our communities, our regions, the opportunity to plan, to implement what this plan calls for.
Well, with that in mind, I have a few questions. When we looked at high-speed rail back many years ago, and then it was subsequently approved by the public, there were certain expectations, there were certain cost considerations, and since that period of time, the cost estimates in this project continue to rise sort of exponentially. But I think, and I want to kind of play off of Senator Monning's observations, Sue, and I think those of yours as well, that rail could be and should be a very integral component of our future transportation planning. And that whether you look at some of the hubs now, I was just in the Bay Area, to BART, a terrific system that really moves people from place to place, especially in a community that continues to grow, and there is going to be a continued need for this kind of transportation. In the Los Angeles area, with work that's being done there on the Blue Line and the Gold Line, and recognizing transit is, rail transit is critical. So with this passenger rail select committee that we set up this year, working with the stakeholders and trying to reestablish rail as a viable method of transportation in California. We Californians, for reasons I don't understand, love our cars. But you just can't keep building your way out of the mess. And as Senator Monning indicated, the high-speed rail does serve a purpose, getting people north and south through the state, but it doesn't deal with the day-to-day traffic, which I think is not only a greenhouse gas issue, but a quality of life issue. There's just so much music you can listen to, and tapes books that you can listen to, and try to get home, to help put the kids to bed or leave after sunrise to get to work. I mean, these are legitimate concerns that we're having. So it seems to me that recognizing the vision of high-speed rail, we have to recognize the vision of inner-city rail that we have not implemented properly in this state. So in looking at that, and with the construct of our passenger rail, our select committee, one of the things that we looked at is how other places, and you mentioned them, from South Korea to Spain to France, have established their high-speed rail system. And what they did is they don't start in an abstract location. They start with the hubs that exist, and they bring them together. They expand. I know that Senator Bell would like to see BART come down to the San Jose area. I know in San Diego they're building out a transit system, which we're doing in Los Angeles. So it sort of begs the question, in looking at a rail system, shouldn't it be an integrated rail system so that we don't isolate high-speed rail over here and we don't isolate another rail system over here? Wouldn't it make more sense if we are trying to create a long-term program where we invest, because this is, a lot of this is infrastructure investment. This is not inexpensive. But if we're going to create a long-term vision for the state, wouldn't it make more sense if we simply took and created a rail department, for example, under the California Transportation Agency? Rather than we've got high-speed rail over in one place, it doesn't have to integrate with any other rail. And if the promise we made to the people of the state was that we were going to integrate it, wouldn't it make more sense that if we're going to start talking about putting 15% annually of $5 billion or 25% or whatever the ultimate number is that the negotiations bring in talking with the governor, wouldn't it make sense if we start looking at this in a more holistic sense, so that we have one agency that addresses the best way to create that high-speed rail at the best cost, the least cost to the taxpayer, while at the same time increasing the supply and the demand for transit in general, which comes from expanding inner-city rail. So could you respond to that? Because I think that may be, if we want to have a win-win, it seems to me that's the best approach.
Two comments. One, Senator Jackson, excellent comments. Two, I don't think we could agree with you more with regards to having a holistic vision and how we invest our dollars, how we leverage our dollars, how we leverage our dollars with the federal government, how we leverage our dollars in the private market will speak volumes if, in fact, we can fulfill our larger vision with interconnectivity with regards to light rail, inner-city rail, as well as the hubs throughout California and high-speed rail. I believe strongly, and I don't believe this is hyperbole or a sense of over-dramatic sense of something that I desire strongly, but Los Angeles Union Station can possibly be the busiest hub in the near future. Perhaps not in the near future, but in mid-term future, and will rival or perhaps surpass Penn Station or Central Station in New York, and clearly Union Station in Washington, D.C. But how we do this, we have to do this in an intelligent fashion. We can't do this in an isolated way where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. You talked about exponential growth in terms of cost with regards to high-speed rail that perhaps were unanticipated. I believe that always has a negative impact on the electorate as a whole, that we're sold, this narrative and why it was critical to vote for this measure, which we still all, by far and large, agree with. Not all, but, by far and large. We need to make sure, that, again, and I'm going to harp back on this issue because I think it's absolutely critical, that what I'm very proud of the framework and the construct that we have created is that we have a set of principles, and we are driving our policy, which we believe is good policy, based on those principles, moving towards rapidly a low-carbon economy and doing so in a manner to get the most bang for the buck for the taxpayers and creates jobs that are real and are tangible. So interconnectivity, intercity rail, light rail, BART, for example, in the East Bay area of going from Fremont and connecting that to Berryessa to the east side to downtown San Jose, which is a really critical issue, I know, for Senator Jim Bell. How we do this is going to be absolutely critical for us so we can leverage as many precious dollars that we can, invest those dollars in a very intelligent way where you can measure, where you can verify, and you can quantify the actual gains that have been made. Carbon that has not been manufactured, meeting our goals, or furthering our position to meeting our goals, and creating jobs that are real and tangible. This is absolutely critical because if we don't do this, and we don't do this correctly and intelligently, understandably so, the electorate will be chagrined, without a doubt, because they'll say, you sold us this and you did the bait and switch, and all of a sudden this has become a trough without a vision for the state of California. So I think that your comments are excellent, and we couldn't agree with you more.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I think most of us do agree with that. I just wonder, as we're going forward and having these discussions, what your thoughts are on trying to create an integrated rail system so that we don't have high-speed rail isolated over here. If we can integrate them by putting them under one caption, one roof, if you will, wouldn't that do what you're talking about here in the most effective way possible?
The key word is connectivity, and it was a word that was talked about a lot when we voted in the legislature on high-speed rail a couple of years ago. And as I said a moment ago, there was some monies in that package for intercity rail. Now what we're doing here is putting forward exactly what you are describing, Senator Jackson, an integrated plan. A plan that includes a permanent source for transit, permanent source for intercity rail, and permanent source for high-speed rail. And it will be up to our state government in future years, and we ought to look at some of the organizational issues about the relationships between Caltrans and the High-Speed Rail Authority and who will administer intercity rail. We need to look at that to make sure that it is in fact a coordinated approach. And I don't know that you said it exactly this way, but I think it's what you mean, that one part of that three-part transportation plan does not work if it stands alone. You can't just do high-speed rail. You can't just do intercity rail. You can't just do transit. You need to do all three, and you need to connect them. And that's what this plan, long-term investment plan, seeks to do.
In the last question, if I may, Mr. Chair. Understanding that the funding is integrated, but the process is what I'm talking about, because I think we all agree on the funding mechanism. Makes great sense. But how do we assure that the actual planning process is integrated? Because we have this high-speed rail program over here, if you will, that is not connected or accountable to any of the other systems, so that if we're going to try to create that connectivity, how do we do that with a high-speed rail program that essentially is accountable to no one?
Well, let's so you know you've been doing this long enough to know that if you don't lay the first part of the foundation, you don't get to the second part. The first part here is to put forward this, an understandable, comprehensive funding strategy. I think the second part, whether we're able to do it as part of this year's budget or it becomes next year's follow-up implementation work, because most of this money is not going to go out in 1 year, is to in fact work with the administration to reorganize those parts of state government which assure the very approach you're talking about.
Thank you. And I think that's what I'm suggesting is that they do need to go hand in glove because the planning process right now is not integrated.
Let me reemphasize and underscore we're a co-equal branch of government, and as policymakers, as lawmakers, we have many opportunities before us to deal with the organizational issue that you're referring to. No pun intended, the interconnectivity, if you will, of the various branches, if you will, or various departments. As was mentioned, high-speed rail, the High-Speed Rail Authority, Caltrans, et cetera, or new entities that are created that are a cross-unit, for lack of a term right now, a cross-unit team that coordinates the various high-speed intercity and interrail transportation modes throughout the state of California. We as legislators have this opportunity to provide the vision if in fact the vision is not provided, so we can again leverage the dollars, get the most bang for the buck, and actually execute in a manner that's the most efficient way to get people out of their cars and get them moving from either one part of the state to another part of the state, or as you had just mentioned, the daily grind of the daily commutes from one part of the city to another part of the city, getting out of vehicles, getting out of old, tired vehicles, and in fact, what you say, improving the quality of life so you can get to point A to point B and actually get home and actually read to your daughter or your son, put him or her to bed, and relax. Obviously, so many of us, especially in Southern California, those who live in the Bay Area, spend so many times. Thank God for Spotify. If it wasn't for Spotify, it'd be even worse. But we spend so many hours. And Caltrans' idea of, well, I don't want to say Caltrans' idea, but expanding HOV lanes, for example, throughout our freeways, whether it's the 405, the 5, the 101, the 10, the 280 or 680, that's not going to be the panacea. Ultimately, we're going to have to get folks out of their cars physically, or obviously move towards near zero or zero emissions EV vehicles for all individuals.
So,
Senator Liu and then Senator Block.
thank you. I just want to follow up with what you just concluded with, Senator De Leon. If indeed transportation is the biggest cause of the greenhouse gas issues that we have here in California and across the world, why is it that the formula that you've come up with delegates only 60% of funding dedicated to transportation? Why not 75% or 80%?
Again, we endeavored to find the best balance between a number of compelling needs. And certainly the natural resource issue is compelling. The alternative vehicles must be a lead strategy because not everybody is going to use transit. The idea of capitalizing green innovation also has merit. So look, in the end, right, writing law, as you know, is line drawing. And these numbers, as Senator De Leon said earlier, may change. They may change based upon our discussions with the Assembly and with the administration. But we think we're talking about significant money here, even at 60%. And again, the fact that it's permanent source means that it itself can be capitalized on the infrastructure side. And our communities and our state can plan for the future.
I hear you, but I am concerned that in order to meet the goals of addressing this issue, that perhaps we need to really rethink about our infrastructure, and it's a long-term investment. So, I would encourage us to maybe up that a little bit to address our huge problems here.
Thank you, Senator Liu. Senator Block, then Senator Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate this alternative proposal. It gives us a lot to think about in terms of ways that we can invest to reduce greenhouse gases beyond just high-speed rail. And I really appreciate that it's a very broad framework and that while we have strategies, there's not a lot of detail here. And I think that's a good thing. I think as we talked about when we did the local control funding formula, sometimes the locals know better than we in San Diego, whether it's the governor or the legislature, on how to exactly spend each dollar. In San Diego, for example, right now there's a move to create more bus-only lanes and have low-emission buses transport people from one place to another. We have a light rail system in the trolley that's working very well in San Diego, has high ridership, but can't go everywhere. So I think within this framework, whether it's under transit or under low-carbon transportation, there are places where cities can build in what they need and not have Sacramento tell them what they need to do. So again, I appreciate that.
Thank you, Senator Block. Senator Bell, Senator Hancock, and then Senator Anderson.
First, I wanted to thank you for presenting this report. I think it's entirely the right concept and frame that we need to have to start talking and discussing how we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, we're not just doing this for California. We're setting a trend for the United States and the world. So we have to kind of realize that everybody's watching us and making sure that we conduct ourselves and do our process in an appropriate manner. And I think just one thing I want to say just generally about the poverty issue that Senator Leno raised and others, Senator De Leon, is that the Brookings Institute did a study on poverty in the United States and access to jobs through transit. And what they said is the old hub and spoke transit plans don't adequately address getting access to jobs for people. It's the old model, the old, hub and spoke, meaning you have a central city and then have transit lines going into the central city and kind of maybe a highway that goes around the city. That doesn't provide adequate access to jobs, because what's happening is both the jobs and the poverty are going into the suburbs. Both the jobs and the poverty are going into the suburbs. In fact, the Brookings Institute, their statement is that poverty, once overwhelmingly concentrated in cities, has likewise drifted into the suburbs. And by 2008, large metropolitan suburbs were home to a larger share, 1/3, of America's poor than big cities, small metropolitan areas or rural areas. So the poverty is now drifting out into, our suburban communities, and so the poverty is becoming diffused out more and more, and that's going to be the trend. And I think if we have a system of transit, it has to kind of reflect that that's what's going on. That's the economic trend that we see. And so for me, I would like to see a strong emphasis on transit. I think that people are in the future, just looking ahead 20 years like we're supposed to in this kind of thing, 20 or 30 years, it's going to be very expensive to drive a vehicle around in our world. And people need other ways of moving around and having access to work and access to getting education and opportunities and all the things that people need to have when they have transportation. So they're going to need like Senator Jackson says, an integrated network. We have developed in this country, in the state, an integrated network of highways. Now we need an integrated network of transit. We need an integrated network. It should be our future goal for the next generation. If we're going to give something to the next generation, to me, this is something that is of value that will last, that we can give to the next generation after we finish this job. And to me, that's why allocating the projects to a system of transit. The thing I want to say about this is there's a lot more work to be done. We're going to talk about I assume, we have just general statements about how we allocate the money, the devil's in the details, as they say, and we have to make sure that that's a fair, evenly distributed, but based on criteria that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's very important that we have an allocation process that's fair, that targets greenhouse gas emissions. And I keep hearing this statement in this year over here when I'm in the Senate chambers, because my seatmate is Senator Pavley, and she keeps saying that, so she's kind of brainwashed me on that one. Senator Pavley, I know you're watching. Senator Pavley has persistence about AB 32, since she was the author, and we really need to focus on the measurable, quantifiable greenhouse gas emission reductions of each project. Just any old project's not going to work. Any old expenditure is not going to work. Just because it's in this category doesn't mean, as Senator Steinberg was saying about the housing, just any old project, it has to prove that it has greenhouse gas emission reductions. It has to prove how it helps low-income communities, and how the access to jobs and creating access is part of the project that we're approving. So we have to have measurable, quantifiable, measurable information for each project that we use this resource for. If we don't, then we're not doing our job. We're not doing our job if we don't measure and quantify the greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm an advocate for a process, whatever it may be, whatever we finally work out, that really is a performance process in measuring the greenhouse gas emissions that show the voters and the people of California that we are working at this overall goal, and that we can achieve greenhouse gas emissions by doing these expenditures. Otherwise, it's just another government program that gives away money, and we're not going to do that here. This is not what we want to do. So I appreciate, this is something that I would support. I think that this is a good strategy. Now let's begin the tough job of making it implemented, as Senator Steinberg says.